What is the meaning of your frightened face and appearance so pale? It seems you just saw all hellish specters fly closer around your ears. In 1572, Dominicus Lampsonius, a Flemish poet and artist, used this poem to convey his analysis of the art of Hieronymus Bosch. Bosch was a 15th century Dutch artist known for his quite insane works of art. He is known for his triptych works, in which he painted 3 panels to unveil usually religious material in his own unique style. Bosch is one of my favorite artists, which is why I'm wearing a dress of his art, which I'll show off in the video later. And he is indeed one of my favorite late medieval artists. His art coming at the end threshold of the medieval period, but also heavily influenced by medievalism. His artistic flair is almost indescribable, and yet so incredibly palpable. Each centimeter of his work explores abstract and weird motifs to the point where you don't know what you're looking at when you first see his paintings. Bosch's art is overwhelming. It is confounding, it is magical, it is moralizing, it is accusatory, it is beautiful, it is violent. But what draws me most to Bosch's artworks are his hellscapes. Bosch's hellscapes are where I believe you can feel his thesis, or the intent of Bosch really bleeding through. Like Bosch's other landscapes, his hells function on a maniacally maximist level. Your eyes simply don't know where to look. However, unlike other landscapes, Bosch is not merely replicating a natural environment, an earthly environment. Bosch is crafting an image of the unimaginable. Hell is unimaginable. Hell is weird. Hell is wild. And how Bosch goes about fabricating this for his audience is by sewing uncanniness into his landscape. Sigmund Freud labeled the uncanny loosely. For this uncanny is in the reality nothing new or alien, but something which is familiar and old established in the mind, and which has become alienated from it only through a process of repression. In Bosch's hellscapes, the audience is not being introduced to something wholly unrecognizable, an indecipherable image. No, we are seeing reality seeping through the cracks, just enough to deeply unsettle us. While for Bosch's other pieces, the uncanny is main stage in fauna and humanoid creatures, it is truly in his hellscapes we see uncanniness engulfing his paintings. Every inch is meant to invoke this unease, this unfamiliar familiarity, an uncanniness with bodies, environment, weapons, and creatures. Freud, in detailing the uncanny, described it akin to having lost one's way in the woods, perhaps after being overtaken by fog, and, despite all one's efforts to find a marked or familiar path, one comes back again and again to the same spot, which one recognizes by a particular physical feature. Bosch taps in to this odd sensation, dragging us into chaotic and smog-filled landscapes. That oddness and uncomfortability sears through us in just a glimpse at Bosch's work, and I would argue that that feeling lies at the core of Bosch's mysterious intentions with his work, something we can never know truly, but is certainly fun to theorize about. In this video, I will introduce the few mysterious bits of Hieronymus Bosch's life and investigate That sense of uncanniness that I believe is imbued in Bosch's Hellscapes. What feeling perhaps Bosch was intending to invoke within us, his audience. Little is known and recorded about Bosch and his life. We know he lived in 's-Hertogenbosch, in which is now southern Holland near the Belgian border, and is known to have been painting as early as 1480 and from then until his death in 1516. There is evidence of the popularity and wealth Bosch amassed during his career. Documents from the 15th and 16th centuries show him as a cornerstone of the Catholic upper class of his hometown, a well-adjusted and well-connected citizen with acquaintances in higher court positions. There's this mythos around Bosch that often associates him as being an outsider or someone suffering from mental illness, but we cannot truly know this, and according to these documents, he was certainly not a wild outcast or proclaimed weirdo of society, like some people may imply. Bosch was at the center of mainstream culture in his region. While in life, people may have understood Bosch and the content of his paintings. Barely past 100 years of his death, the exact essence of Bosch's art had become utterly cryptic and even humorous by art historians and critics. That myth surrounding Bosch and his mental health, one that lingers predominantly in theory and not in actual solid historical documentation or evidence, likely stems from the period in which Bosch's popularity was reinvigorated, a time where psychoanalysts reigned. Bosch's paintings were rediscovered by art history at the time when Sigmund Freud invented his theories on trauma and established the method of psychoanalysis. It is certainly no coincidence that in the decades following the discovery of the human psyche and its analysis, there was a rising interest in Bosch. Scholars have often sought to psychoanalyze Bosch. Already in the 1920s, the artist was suspected of sexual pathologies, and by the 1930s, his fantasies were routinely understood as products of his or his culture's unconscious desires. There's a glaring issue with this attempt to psychoanalyze Bosch. Of course, one that I particularly dislike. It is in the fact that we simply do not know enough about this man's personality, thoughts, mental state to even suggest a reasonable psychiatric diagnosis. Evidently, this didn't stop the psychoanalysts. But what we can decipher from Bosch's puzzling nature is certain things about his environment and culture that undoubtedly weasel their way into his work. For one, as you can see in this title, there's a label of medieval stamped onto Bosch, despite him being pretty much at the tail end or even beyond the medieval period. But those medievalism influences certainly don't just disappear out of nowhere past a certain date. Am I right? And Bosch's art undeniably uses medievalism as a touchstone in both aesthetic and moralizing attitudes. Bosch's hometown was littered with intricate medieval architecture, which displayed carved monsters interspersed with effigies of the artisans who built the cathedral shimmy up its great buttresses. And on many of its vault frescoes, fantastical creatures abound. These examples of the artist's immediate environment belong to a grotesque imagery ubiquitous in late medieval culture. All of Bosch's creatures probably have precedence somewhere. In not just Hellscapes, Bosch draws upon the architecture of his home to craft images of bizarre landscapes, touching on that uncanny nature. Manipulating what was familiar to Bosch, especially the creatures in their grotesque and fantastical forms. and those around him to design breathtakingly fantastical and horrifying landscapes. For Bosch himself, the familiar and the unfamiliar coalesce in his work, and it is possible that he understood to some effect the mental effect that it would have on his audience as well, especially as a famed and popular painter. Veering towards his hellscapes, one needs only to look to culture that would have undoubtedly been at the back of Bosch's mind, or even at the front while he was making his creations. The first being the prevalence of fears about witchcraft and devilry. We can never know Bosch's exact thoughts on witchcraft and the existence of the devil, but we do in fact know that in his day it was believed that the devil could be a physical as well as a spiritual reality. His revelations of demonic activity and man's predicament must have been terrifying as a nightmare come true. Similarly, as for witchcraft, amongst Bosch's important formative influences must be reckoned the universal belief in witchcraft, which became such a vital matter to everyone during the last 20 years of the 15th century, that is, the period when Bosch produced his major works. For Bosch, the evils that he's portraying may not just stop at the idea of fantasy and imagination, but could certainly be a depiction of the deep-seated fears in which Bosch took it upon himself to be his moral responsibility to convey to his audiences. One can imagine him exploiting these already existing narratives about witchcraft and devilry to develop abstract ideas about hell into tangible realities that hide images from his culture in plain sight. And for Bosch, these hellscapes mimic not only fantastical fears about witchery, but also the treacherous natural environment of Northern and Western Europe. The country was populated by hostile demons, creatures of swamp and forest, dark winters and uncertain summers. Birds, beasts, and trees concealed the real identity of the supernatural. The little men, magic birds, sinister beasts, the ogre in the oak, the enchanted forest, the magic mountain, were realities that still persist in fairy tales. The publication of Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches, by Heinrich Kramer in 1486, which coincides with Bosch's lifetime, connected witchery and the devil to great natural disasters as well as nature itself. Malleus Maleficarum was incredibly popular throughout Europe, and it would have been highly likely that Bosch at least knew of these concepts while making his art. This blend of the unreal and the real, the fantastical and the culturally accepted, creates an uncanny reality within Bosch's work, one that highlights the obscure and familiar parts of nature as dangerous and exploits that connotation to form what is Bosch's hellscapes. We see Bosch's hellscapes in a variety of his paintings. There is The Garden of Earthly Delights between 1490 and 1510, Hermit Saints, 1493, The Last Judgment, 1482, The Last Judgment again, 1486, Fragment of The Last Judgment between 1506 and 1508, The Haywain, 1516, The Flood Panels, 1514, Fall of the Damned into Hell before 1490, Hell, 1490, and Christ's Descent into Hell, around 1505. Overwhelmingly, Bosch's depictions of hell are claustrophobic, jam-packed with eccentric creatures performing odd tortures, often, but not always, related to butts. Objects like musical instruments, fishing tools, cauldrons, arrows, pikes, and halberds, all used to torture the unlucky humans that find themselves in Bosch's hell. Human bodies stripped bare, as we see so evidently in the Garden of Earthly Delights, and their faces pulled into ecstatic or horrified expressions. Amidst this torture, these humans and their expressions decry their pain and suffering, however, with a blankness that eerily suggests a resignment. The unusual hellish torture made with familiar objects is simply something that must be accepted, and in that we can uncover an emotional and spiritual sense of uncanniness. Hell, the unfamiliar and the unknowable, must be accepted as true, real, and a familiar consequence for medieval Christians. The creatures of Bosch's hell are more hauntingly humanoid. It is even harder to tell where the animal origins of them lie. Some creatures, like in the Hermit Saints painting, are mashups of so many different animal aspects, they become impossible to comprehend fully when we look at them. Although implicitly we see bird beaks, wings, fish, leg, frog-like heads, tails, we recognize these traits, but we cannot conclusively pull this into an animal that we know, although we are familiar with its body parts. In the Hermit Saints painting, we also see a free-walking head, one undoubtedly connected to the unnatural naturalness of witchcraft. Shadow-like humanoid figures in The Last Judgment, Vienna, haunt the landscape as more sentient-seeming, but still all the more animalistic with their oddly shaped mouths. Even when we think we might have something close to human here in Bosch's hell, it is all but just another moving fixture of the landscape, one built to continue its eerie afflictions onto the poor humans trapped there. The humanoid theme extends into far darker territory, as we see in Christ's descent into hell, where humans wander, tortured in and out of a large, almost cosmically terrifying mouth. What we think might be the closest to humans down there, Bosch's hells, are just twisted versions of our familiar humanity, ones that will consume us whole. Other creatures also devour us in hell, as though we are the easy prey, an uncanny mimicry of the wild nature we are familiar with, but one that is now fully weaponized against us. In the Haywain triptych, at the bottom, one easily spots the humanoid fish figure in the middle of consuming a human. Another fish-like figure consumes a human, all but leg, with one spare limb laying about him, suggesting a particularly violent meal at the bottom of the Last Judgment from Bruges. These fish, I find, are an interesting and potential bastardization of Jesus Christ's fish tale, in which Jesus multiplies fish for consumption. Instead now, the fish consumes human on a widespread scale in hell. In the hell of the Garden of Earthly Delights, we also see this motif of consumption and cannibalism repeatedly. Dogfish, armored creatures pile on top of a helpless human at the bottom of the painting, while a bird-like humanoid swallows a person whole right above. In Bosch's hell, humans are prime for consumption, incredibly vulnerable to it. Certainly touching upon those fears of wilderness and witchcraft, those that at this time Bosch would be highly familiar with. Those fears of the fantastical become all the more real through Bosch's paintings, threatening us, consuming us through our fears as we view the art. Bosch's art ingests us through uncanniness. It engulfs us, it doesn't let us go. It captivates our attention. It does not allow us to dissociate. We must recognize ourselves in these naked and bare humans, and we must recognize the dangers of hell as an amplified version of real life, real world dangers. The unnatural naturalness of Bosch's hell doesn't end at the figures that fill the landscape, but also in the landscape itself. Unlike Bosch's other landscapes, the land of hell is incredibly barren. Simply look at Christ's descent into hell to see the strongest effects of this barrenness. It is an unlivable, ungovernable, unfarmable place. This barren hellscape could relate to what Hemphill was suggesting about Bosch's region, North and Western Europe, where winters could be so harsh to decay the landscape and to strike famine upon all creatures. Bosch takes this very real and raw fear and molds it into the hellscape, using skeletons of livestock off to the side to invoke this underlying sense of horror and dread that would have been familiar. It is the ultimate sign of suffering that his audience would know so very well. It is pointed directly at them. To experience barrenness and famine in life is one thing, but in the land of pain and torture in hell is a whole new but familiar animal. This threat upon the landscape is truly punctured by the smoke and fires that descend and christen the hellscapes in almost every hellscape painting, even the ones that appear to be underwater, such as in the flood panels. Bosch's hometown, sometime in his early years during 1463, a massive fire ravaged the city, and likely Bosch would have witnessed this horrific tragedy. Evidently, in Bosch's hell, he implanted these haunting fires into the paintings, fires that loom over an entire landscape at the back, almost like these fires could have been at the back of Bosch's mind as he painted these landscapes. Bosch's own familiarity with tragedy is inserted into these hellscapes, forming a deeper relationship between the familiar and the unfamiliar that Bosch himself would have been affected by. Bosch is an artist, more than likely, who knew the power of blending the familiar and the unfamiliar, the natural and the unnatural, the real and the unreal, for not just his audience, but himself. Embedding uncanniness into these hellscapes allows for what might seem as a distant place to become uncomfortably close to you. Bosch forces his audience to reckon with their proximity to hell, making that intangible proximity physical and visual. Their own relationships, his audience's own relationships with hell that stem from their familiar realities. Bosch creates something that is not altogether new or foreign to his audience, but molds something that may exist only in repression, which precisely tackles Freud's image of the uncanny. Perhaps Bosch is suggesting to us that we are much closer to the alienating and eerie wilderness than we once thought. That maybe we have been overtaken by this hellishness in our lives by subtle ways. And as much as we try to grasp at anything familiar in the unfamiliar landscape of hell, that familiarity that we try to hold on to just becomes nonsense in our own hand, just becomes another facet of the most horrifying and absurdist experience we can ever have in our lives, or rather in our afterlives as well. Thank you guys so much for listening to another video essay of mine. I really hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope that you were able to find some fruitful food for thought for yourselves. Like and subscribe to me for more horror and medieval history related content. Feel free to follow me on TikTok, where I post some more short form essay, horror, and medieval related content. Also, let me know what you guys think about my essay in the comments and what your own thoughts on Bosch's paintings and his hells are. Bye! Alright guys, showing you this dress. which I got not specifically for this video, but specifically because I love Bosch. So here's this so that you can get the whole view, but this is from the Garden of Earthly Delights. Anyways, that's it. See? Nice.